My own daughter smiled brightly as she handed her father-in-law a first-class Mediterranean cruise ticket. Then she turned to me, her actual father, and tossed a crumpled $2 gas station scratch-off ticket onto my plate. She thought she was putting a useless old man in his place. She had absolutely no idea that cheap piece of paper was about to hit a $120 million jackpot and become the very weapon I would use to completely dismantle her perfect life. I am William. I am 76 years old, and somehow I am still healing from the deep wounds my own flesh and blood inflicted on me. As a retired structural engineer, I spent my entire life building strong foundations, always believing that if you supported the people you loved, they would hold strong. I was wrong. I escaped their toxicity, but the lessons I learned cost me everything I thought I knew. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who severely underestimated your worth. It was a warm Sunday afternoon, and I was sitting at a massive mahogany dining table inside the sprawling suburban home of my daughter Melissa and her husband Derek. Growing up, I provided a modest but loving home for Melissa. Now sitting in her newly acquired fortress of marble floors, vaulted ceilings, and crystal chandeliers, I felt entirely out of place. The air was thick with the smell of expensive catered food and the pretentious chatter of Derek's family. Sitting directly across from me was Martin Lawson, Derek's father. Martin was a man who loved the sound of his own voice. He spent the entire afternoon boasting about his corporate investments, making sure everyone at the table knew exactly how important he supposedly was. I sat quietly in my faded corduroy jacket, missing my late wife, Patricia, and simply hoping to enjoy a peaceful Father's Day meal with my only child. As the main course was cleared, Melissa stood up at the head of the table. She tapped her manicured fingernails against her wine glass to demand everyone's attention. A hush fell over the dining room. She announced that she and Derek had prepared a very special surprise to honor the fathers in the room. I felt a small, foolish flicker of warmth in my chest. I thought perhaps she had remembered how difficult the past few years had been for me since her mother passed away. Melissa walked confidently over to Martin. She handed him a heavy gold-embossed envelope with a wide, theatrical smile. Martin opened it, feigning surprise, and pulled out a glossy travel itinerary. Melissa's voice boomed across the silent room, ensuring every single guest heard her clearly. She announced that because Martin had been dealing with so much stress from his intense business ventures, she and Derek had pooled all their resources together. They had purchased him an all-inclusive, first-class $13,000 cruise package to Europe. The table erupted in loud applause. Derek puffed out his chest, looking immensely proud of his wealth. Martin stood up, hugged Melissa tightly, and declared loudly that she was the absolute best daughter-in-law a man could ever ask for. I smiled politely and clapped along with the rest of them. As the applause died down, the room grew quiet again. I waited patiently for my turn. Melissa turned her attention to me. There was no gold envelope in her hands. There was no grand speech about my sacrifices or my hard work. Instead, she reached casually into the pocket of her cardigan. She pulled out a crumpled, brightly colored piece of paper and carelessly tossed it across the polished wooden table. It fluttered in the air for a second before landing face down right on top of my plate. I stared at it. It was a cheap $2 lottery scratch-off ticket, the kind you grab at the gas station checkout counter with your spare change. The kind of afterthought you give to an acquaintance, not to your father on Father's Day. The celebratory atmosphere in the room instantly evaporated, replaced by a suffocating, painful awkwardness. A few of the guests shifted uncomfortably in their expensive chairs. I looked at the cheap piece of cardboard, and then I slowly looked up at my daughter. She was smiling, but it was not a smile of affection. It was a tight, performative smirk, as if daring me to complain in front of her high society friends. I glanced across the table at Derek. He let out a low, mocking chuckle, taking a slow sip of his red wine. He did not even try to hide his amusement at my humiliation. Then I looked at Martin, the man holding a $13,000 vacation in his hands. He looked at me with a sickening expression of pure pity, shaking his head slightly, viewing me as a pathetic old charity case who had wandered into their lavish dinner party. My chest tightened. My breathing slowed. As an engineer, my mind had been trained to assess weight, pressure, and breaking points. Right then, looking around that magnificent dining room, I felt the invisible foundation of my family cracking. I looked at the marble floors beneath my feet and the vaulted ceilings above my head. And the sheer, unadulterated audacity of what was happening made my blood run ice cold. I did not raise my voice. I did not shout. But when I finally spoke, the low, steady timbre of my tone cut through the dead silence of the room like a steel blade. "A $2 scratch off," I said slowly. I picked up the flimsy ticket between my thumb and index finger, holding it up for the entire table to see. I looked directly into Melissa's eyes. "That is fascinating, Melissa. It is especially fascinating considering the fact that we are sitting in a house that I bought for you." Her fake smile faltered. Derek stopped laughing. The entire room went completely rigid. I continued, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "3 years ago, right after your mother, Patricia, passed away, you sat crying on my front porch. You begged me for help. You told me you and Derek were desperate and that you would lose the opportunity to buy this absolute dream house if you did not come up with a massive down payment. You knew I did not have that kind of cash lying around. So I took the rural land your mother's family had owned for 3 generations. The land she loved more than anything in this world. And I sold it. I handed you a cashier's check for $60,000 so you could afford to sleep under this roof. And today, to celebrate Father's Day, you purchased your father-in-law a $13,000 trip across the ocean, and you bought the man who paid for your home a $2 piece of trash." The guests stared down at their laps, absolutely horrified. No one dared to breathe, let alone speak. Melissa's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. Her jaw worked as she opened her mouth to defend herself, clearly preparing to spin a plausible lie about how tight money was ready to play the victim right there in front of her friends. But I did not give her the satisfaction of a debate. The man I used to be, the forgiving, silent father, who just wanted to keep the peace and be loved by his daughter, died right there at that mahogany table. I slowly folded the $2 ticket in half and slid it into the breast pocket of my faded jacket. I placed my cloth napkin neatly beside my plate. I pushed my heavy oak chair back, the harsh scraping sound echoing loudly against the cold marble floors. I stood up to my full height and adjusted my collar. I looked at Derek, who was now glaring at me with open, unmasked hostility. I looked at Martin, clutching his golden envelope like a shield. Finally, I looked one last time at the daughter I had raised. I did not curse at them. I simply turned my back, walked down the long hallway, and stepped out the heavy front door into the cool evening air. I left my dinner untouched. I left their toxic, hollow household behind me in the rearview mirror of my old truck. And as I drove away into the night, I had absolutely no idea that the crumpled piece of paper resting against my chest was about to become the ultimate instrument of their absolute destruction. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, sealing away the stifling air of that extravagant house. I stood on the massive stone porch for just a moment, letting the cool evening breeze wash over my face. The driveway was paved with custom-stamped concrete, a completely unnecessary luxury that Derek had insisted on when they built the place. I walked slowly toward my 15-year-old pickup truck, parked at the very edge of the property. They always asked me to park near the street, claiming my truck leaked oil on their pristine driveway. It did not leak a single drop, but I never argued with them about it. I simply wanted to see my daughter. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the crumpled $2 lottery ticket. It felt like a physical weight against my chest. Before I could even put my key into the lock of the truck door, I heard the sharp, frantic clicking of expensive high heels striking the pavement behind me. "Dad, wait a minute. Just wait." I paused, my hand resting on the rusted door handle. I turned around slowly. Melissa was marching down the driveway, her posture defensive, and her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The soft glow of the landscape lighting illuminated her face, highlighting the deep frown lines that completely contradicted the sweet, innocent persona she always tried to project to the outside world. She reached out and grabbed my forearm, her grip surprisingly tight. There was no apology in her eyes. There was only the panicked desperation of someone who had just been publicly embarrassed and needed to instantly regain control of the narrative. "Dad, you are being completely ridiculous." She started, her voice dropping into that condescending, patronizing tone she always used when she wanted to make me feel like a foolish child. "You are making a massive scene over absolutely nothing. You walked out in front of all of Derek's family, and now everyone is inside talking about how terribly you are behaving. Why do you always have to be so incredibly sensitive?" I looked down at her hand gripping my arm, and then I looked directly into her eyes. I did not say a word. My silence clearly unnerved her because she immediately launched into a frantic, rehearsed defense. "You have to be realistic, Dad." She continued, speaking faster now, her voice rising in pitch. "You have terrible arthritis in both of your knees. You complain about the pain every single time it rains. How on earth could you possibly go on a European cruise? You cannot walk around cobblestone streets in the Mediterranean. You would be absolutely miserable, and you know it. We were actually being considerate of your health." She let go of my arm and took a step back, throwing her hands up in the air, as if she were the ultimate victim of a grave injustice. "And you have no idea what Derek and I are dealing with behind closed doors," she pleaded, forcing a heavy sigh. "We are completely broke right now, Dad. We are drowning in expenses. Martin's business is failing terribly. He is on the verge of total bankruptcy, and he has been deeply depressed for months. We were genuinely terrified that he might do something drastic. We had absolutely no choice. Derek and I maxed out our very last line of credit to buy him that trip. We did it to save his life, to give him a reason to keep going. We have zero cash left. The scratch-off ticket was just a fun, harmless joke, because we literally could not afford to buy anything else." I stood there in the quiet driveway, listening to my only child spin a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. It was a plausible lie, perfectly constructed to trigger my paternal guilt. She was using my physical ailments to justify her cruelty. She was using her father-in-law's supposed mental health crisis to excuse their lavish spending. She was portraying herself as a selfless, financially ruined savior who was simply trying to keep her family afloat. For a moment, I just looked at her. I looked at the brand-new tailored designer dress she was wearing, which I knew cost well over $1,000. I looked past her shoulder to the driveway, where Derek's gleaming, custom-ordered luxury SUV sat parked next to her own high-end imported sedan. I looked at the manicured landscaping, the towering fountain in the center of the yard, and the glowing windows of the mansion that my wife's family land had paid for. They were completely broke. They had maxed out their last line of credit. They could not afford a real gift for the father who had funded their perfect suburban life. If I were the man I was an hour ago, I would have crumbled. I would have felt terribly guilty for making a scene. I would have apologized for misunderstanding their financial struggles and ruining their elegant dinner party. I would have driven home feeling like a burden, just as she intended. But that man was gone. My vision was suddenly crystal clear. I accepted her lie on the surface, choosing not to engage in a pointless screaming match on a manicured lawn. I gave her a slow, measured nod. "I understand, Melissa," I said quietly. My voice was perfectly calm, devoid of any anger or accusation. "I understand completely." Her shoulders immediately relaxed. She let out a long breath, clearly believing she had successfully managed the situation. She reached out and patted my shoulder, a hollow gesture of affection. "I knew you would understand, Dad. Drive home safely, okay? We will call you later this week when things calm down." I opened the creaking door of my old truck, climbed into the worn driver's seat, and started the engine. I did not look back as I backed out of the driveway and merged onto the dark, quiet road, heading toward my side of town. The drive home was 30 miles of open, unlit highway. The rhythmic humming of the engine usually brought me peace, but tonight my mind was racing. As a structural engineer, my entire career had been built on mathematics logic and identifying critical stress points. You cannot lie to physics, and you cannot lie to basic arithmetic. As the streetlights flickered past my windshield, my brain began to meticulously dissect her excuse. She claimed they were completely broke. She claimed they had maxed out their credit to save Martin. But a $13,000 vacation package is not a small, casual purchase. Financial institutions do not hand out massive unsecured lines of credit to people who are actively drowning in debt and facing business bankruptcy. Credit card companies cut your limits when you are failing. They do not expand them for luxury travel. The math simply did not add up. The foundation of her story was fundamentally flawed. If they were truly out of money, and if Martin was truly going under, that $13,000 had to come from somewhere else. It had to be a liquid asset. It had to be cash entirely. The tires of my truck crunched against the loose gravel of my narrow driveway. I parked beneath the old oak tree that Patricia and I had planted 40 years ago. My house was small, a modest single-story structure with fading siding and a creaking front porch. It was a stark, almost laughable contrast to the sprawling architectural marvel I had just left behind. But stepping through the front door, I felt an immediate sense of relief. The air here was still and quiet, carrying the faint, familiar scent of old books and the lavender soap Patricia used to love. I walked into the kitchen and flipped on the overhead light. It buzzed softly, casting a warm yellow glow across the scratched linoleum countertops. I pulled off my heavy jacket and let it drop over the back of a wooden dining chair. I felt utterly discarded, hollowed out by the sheer callousness of my own daughter. I sat down heavily at the small kitchen table, staring blankly at the empty space in front of me. I reached into my shirt pocket and pulled out the crumpled piece of cardboard. The $2 scratch-off ticket lay flat on the table, its brightly colored graphics seeming almost offensive in the quiet dimness of my kitchen. It was a cheap, thoughtless gesture, a physical manifestation of exactly how little I mattered to them. I let out a long, heavy sigh. I reached into my trouser pocket and fished out a dull, worn penny. I did not actually care about the game, nor did I harbor any foolish hopes of winning a few bucks. It was simply a mechanical motion, a distraction. To keep my hands busy while my mind raced with the painful memories of the evening. I pressed the edge of the copper coin against the silver coating of the first play area. I scraped the penny back and forth in a slow, rhythmic motion, brushing away the gray dust to reveal the hidden symbols beneath. The game was a standard match, the numbers format, something designed to drain loose change from hopeful commuters. I scratched off the top row, revealing the 3 winning numbers, a 12, a 42, and a 17. I moved the penny down to my numbers, scratching off the gray film 1 row at a time. The first row yielded nothing, just random mismatched digits that meant the ticket was exactly as worthless as I had expected it to be. I moved to the second row, my mind still replaying Melissa's defensive voice in my head. I scratched the first box. A 12. I paused, blinking down at the cardboard. A matching number. I felt a mild, insignificant spark of mild amusement. I moved the penny down to reveal the prize amount located directly beneath the matched 12. I scratched away the coating, expecting to see a $2 prize, a simple break-even scenario. But the printed text beneath the gray dust was significantly longer than a single digit. I rubbed my eyes, thinking the dim overhead light was playing tricks on my tired vision. I leaned in closer, my breathing suddenly catching in the back of my throat. The prize amount was not $2. It was not $20. Printed in bold, undeniable black ink were the words 120 million. I froze. My hand began to tremble so violently that the dull penny clattered out of my grip and bounced across the linoleum table. I grabbed the ticket with both hands, bringing it inches from my face. I read the numbers again. I checked the rules printed on the back. I looked at the front. 120 followed by 6 zeros. $120 million. My heart slammed against my wrist with terrifying force. A deafening, ringing silence completely consumed the kitchen. I stood up so quickly that my wooden chair tipped backward and crashed onto the floor. I began to pace the small room, my chest heaving as I tried to pull oxygen into my lungs. The sheer magnitude of the number was utterly incomprehensible. It was a massive generation-altering fortune. It was the kind of wealth that shifted tectonic plates, the kind of money that rewrote destinies. I was suddenly holding a financial empire in the palm of my calloused hands. A massive wave of adrenaline washed over me. My first immediate instinct was completely automatic. It was the deeply ingrained reflex of a father who had spent his entire life providing for his family. I lunged across the kitchen and snatched my cell phone off the counter. I needed to call Melissa. I needed to tell her that all of her terrible financial struggles were permanently over. I wanted to hear the relief in her voice, to tell her that she and Derek would never have to worry about credit limits or bankruptcy ever again. I pulled up her contact name on the illuminated screen. My thumb hovered just a fraction of an inch above the green call button. But right in that critical fraction of a second, my thumb froze. I did not press the button. A cold, heavy sensation began to spread through my stomach, completely neutralizing the adrenaline. The echo of her voice from the driveway replayed vividly in my mind. We are completely broke right now. We maxed out our last line of credit. My engineering mind, the same that had calculated stress loads and structural failures for 4 decades, locked onto that specific variable. The math simply did not work. If she was telling the truth about being entirely broke, the $13,000 vacation package could not possibly exist. If she was lying about being broke, then her cruelty on the porch was not born of desperation, but of pure, unadulterated malice. And if she was lying about something so fundamental to her own father, what else was she hiding? I slowly lowered the phone. The warm, paternal urge to rescue my daughter evaporated, replaced by a sharp, calculating clarity. I walked deliberately out of the kitchen and down the short hallway to my bedroom. I knelt on the floor, pulled back the edge of the woven area rug, and unlocked the heavy steel floor safe hidden beneath the floorboards. I carefully placed the winning lottery ticket inside the dark metal chamber and spun the heavy combination dial, locking the massive fortune securely away from the world. I stood up and stared down at the hidden compartment, feeling the immense weight of the secret I was now keeping. I knew exactly what I had to do next. My entire life had just changed forever in an instant, but I absolutely could not allow sudden excitement to blind my rational judgment. Before I could even consider telling a single living soul that I was a newly minted multimillionaire, I needed absolute proof of my daughter's true financial situation. I needed hard, undeniable facts to either confirm my deepest fears or completely prove me wrong. Tomorrow morning, I was driving straight down to the local bank to finally uncover the real truth, not the state lottery office. The sun rose over my quiet house, casting long, pale shadows across the kitchen floor, where I had paced for hours. I had barely slept. Every time I closed my heavy eyes, the image of that $120 million prize flashed brightly in the darkness. But the harsh morning light brought a cold, sharp reality back to my tired mind. Before I could even begin to process my entirely new life, I had to deal with the old one. I dressed in my usual faded flannel shirt and work jeans, making absolutely sure the heavy steel floor safe was securely locked beneath the woven rug. I poured myself a cup of bitter black coffee, drank it standing up, and grabbed my truck keys. The drive into town was a complete blur. I navigated the familiar turns purely by muscle memory. The morning traffic moved sluggishly along the damp roads, but my mind was completely focused on the local bank branch. I needed to see the numbers. I parked my truck outside the familiar brick building the exact same bank I had faithfully used for nearly 40 years. Patricia and I had proudly opened our very first joint savings account right here in this lobby. We had trusted this institution with our lives and our modest earnings. I walked through the heavy double-glass doors and joined the short, quiet line of morning customers. When it was finally my turn, I approached a teller named Sarah. I knew her very well. She had always been genuinely kind to me, asking about my vegetable garden and my aching knees. Today, I simply asked her to print out the latest statement for my joint emergency retirement account. I had opened this specific account 5 years ago, shortly after my first mild heart scare. I had carefully placed $45,000 into it, money I had painstakingly saved from decades of grueling overtime on various dusty construction sites. I added Melissa's name to the account as a joint owner for one specific, very practical reason. If I passed away suddenly, I wanted to make sure she had immediate, frictionless access to cash to cover my funeral expenses and settle any lingering medical bills. It was my final quiet act of paternal protection, ensuring she would never be financially burdened by my passing. Sarah smiled warmly and tapped quietly on her computer keyboard. But a few seconds later, her cheerful smile completely vanished. She stared intently at her computer monitor, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. She typed a few more keys, clicking her mouse several times, and then she slowly looked up at me. Her eyes were suddenly filled with an unmistakable, profound sympathy. It was the exact kind of look people give you right after they deliver a devastating, life-altering tragedy. She did not say a single word. She simply printed the statement, placed it face down on the polished counter, and slid it toward me with a slightly trembling hand. I thanked her quietly, picked up the warm paper, and walked over to a quiet leather chair situated in the far corner of the lobby. I turned the paper over. My analytical engineering mind, trained to read complex blueprints and identify hidden structural flaws, scanned the columns of numbers. I looked at the bottom line first. The total available balance was not $45,000. The balance was negative $12.50. The account was completely empty. It was heavily overdrawn. The black ink on the white paper felt like a physical blow to my chest, stealing the air from my lungs. I felt a cold, sickening drop in the very pit of my stomach. I moved my eyes up to the transaction history, tracking the rapid flow of the vanished funds. Over the last 3 months, a series of precise, calculated wire transfers had drained the account completely dry. There were 5 separate wire transfers listed on the page. Each individual transfer was for exactly $9,000. As a man who had dealt with massive corporate payrolls and strict government contracts, I recognized the shady pattern immediately. Financial institutions are required by strict federal law to report any cash transaction or wire transfer over $10,000 directly to the Internal Revenue Service. By moving the money in incredibly precise increments of $9,000, the person draining my account was intentionally bypassing the automatic government flagging system. This was not a desperate, impulsive withdrawal made in a moment of sudden panic. This was a deliberate, methodical, and highly calculated theft. I looked closely at the final destination of the wire transfers. Every single one of them had been routed directly into a private, external checking account owned exclusively by Derek Lawson. I sat frozen in the quiet bank lobby, the piece of paper shaking slightly in my tight grip. The scattered pieces of the puzzle slammed together with terrifying, undeniable clarity. Melissa did not max out her credit cards to buy that $13,000 European cruise for her boastful father-in-law. She did not sacrifice her own financial stability to save a deeply depressed man from ruin. She and her arrogant husband had systematically stolen the exact money I had set aside for my own quiet burial. They maliciously took the funds meant for my casket and used them to purchase a first-class luxury vacation for a man who looked at me like I was a pathetic, uneducated beggar. My own daughter had ruthlessly stripped away my final safety net, simply to fund her father-in-law's extravagant, boastful lifestyle. The sheer, breathtaking scale of the betrayal was absolutely paralyzing. The primal instinct to rage, to drive directly to her pristine suburban mansion and forcefully demand an explanation, surged hotly through my veins. I wanted to throw the printed bank statement right in her face and watch her struggle to invent another plausible, manipulative lie. I wanted to see the color drain from her face when she realized her theft was discovered. But I forced myself to remain seated. Confronting her right now would be a massive tactical error. If they were truly willing to steal my funeral money and lie directly to my face while casually sipping expensive wine, there was absolutely no limit to their deception. A loud confrontation would only give them precious time to hide their tracks and invent a new defense. I folded the bank statement meticulously and slipped it deep into my pocket, right next to the exact space where the winning lottery ticket had rested the night before. I stood up, walked out of the heavy glass doors, and stepped back into the bright morning sun. I was not going to yell. I was not going to demand any empty answers. I knew that dealing with people who had no moral compass required patience, strategy, and an iron will. Instead, I was going to dig deeper, much deeper, until I uncovered every single hidden layer of their thoroughly rotten foundation. I would absolutely never stop my pursuit until I brought their entire fragile house of cards crashing down violently around them. I knew Melissa and Derek's schedules perfectly. They both worked demanding corporate jobs, rarely returning to their pristine suburban fortress before 6 in the evening. I drove my old truck back across town, parking a full block away from their manicured lawn just to be cautious. I walked the rest of the way, my heavy boots making no sound on the perfectly swept pavement. I approached the side door, slipping my hand into my pocket to retrieve the spare brass key Melissa had given me 2 years ago. She had handed it to me with a sweet smile, claiming it was for emergencies. I slid the key into the deadbolt and turned it. The heavy door clicked open smoothly. I stepped inside the quiet, climate-controlled house. The air felt entirely different in here during the day. Without the loud, boastful chatter of Derek's family, or the clinking of expensive wine glasses, the massive house felt hollow and profoundly sterile. I did not waste my time wandering through their spacious living room or peering into their luxurious master bedroom. My engineering background taught me to always search for the structural blueprints when investigating a failure. In this case, the blueprints to their lives would be located in one specific room. I walked directly down the carpeted hallway and stepped into Derek's home office. The room was a monument to his towering ego. Dark mahogany bookshelves lined the walls filled with thick volumes I seriously doubted he had ever opened. A massive glass desk dominated the center of the room, completely clear of any actual work. I closed the door quietly behind me and walked around to the heavy leather desk chair. I knelt on the plush carpet and pulled out the small woven wastebasket hidden beneath the glass. It was empty, but sitting directly next to it was a high-capacity paper shredder, its clear plastic bin packed tightly with thin white strips of destroyed documents. People who are completely broke and struggling to survive do not typically run their household paperwork through a heavy-duty cross-cut shredder. They simply throw their utility bills in the trash. Shredders are specifically used by people who have something very important to hide. I carefully unlatched the top mechanical unit of the machine and set it aside. I gently lifted this plastic bin and dumped the mountain of shredded paper directly onto the center of Derek's pristine glass desk. It looked like an impossible, chaotic puzzle. But I had spent 4 decades painstakingly assembling complex steel bridges and massive concrete overpasses from thousands of individual scattered components. A pile of shredded paper was not going to defeat me. I pulled a roll of clear adhesive tape from a nearby drawer and sat down in the leather chair. I began the tedious, grueling process of sorting the paper strips. I separated the pieces by color, by the thickness of the paper, and by the faint traces of corporate logos printed on the edges. I worked in absolute unbroken silence for nearly 2 solid hours. My aging eyes strained against the afternoon sunlight streaming through the office blinds, but my hands remained perfectly steady. Slowly, the fragmented strips began to form a cohesive picture. I taped the pieces together, recreating the destroyed documents one painful inch at a time. The first document I successfully reconstructed was a massive credit card statement from a premium banking institution. I traced my finger down the column of charges. There it was. A single glaring transaction processed just 2 weeks ago. It was a direct payment to a luxury European cruise line for exactly $13,400. But looking closely at the top of the reconstructed page, the truth became even more sickening. This was not a standard credit card. This account was directly linked to the home equity line of credit they had somehow secretly attached to my house. They did not just steal the $45,000 in cash from my retirement fund. They were actively draining the actual equity of the very roof over my head to finance their glamorous lifestyle. I pushed the credit card statement aside and focused on a different pile of thicker, glossy paper strips. These pieces featured the distinct embossed logo of a high-end German automotive dealership. I carefully lined up the jagged edges and applied the clear tape, smoothing it down flat against the glass desk. It was an executed lease agreement. The vehicle detailed on the page was a brand new, fully loaded Porsche sports car, carrying a staggering monthly payment that exceeded the cost of most people's mortgages. But it was this name listed on the primary lease agreement that made my blood run entirely cold. The luxury vehicle was not registered to Derek. It was not registered to Melissa. The expensive sports car was registered directly to Lawson Logistics, the exact company owned by Martin Lawson. The same Martin Lawson who was supposedly drowning in terrible debt, facing complete financial ruin, and suffering from severe, crippling depression. The story Melissa had tearfully spun for me in the driveway was completely unraveling before my eyes. Why on earth would Derek go through the trouble of leasing a phenomenally expensive luxury sports car under the corporate name of a man who was actively going bankrupt? You do not buy a sinking ship a new coat of paint. You do not purchase high-end sports cars for a business that is supposedly collapsing under the weight of its own debts. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, staring at the taped documents spread across the desk. The financial web they had woven was infinitely thicker, darker, and vastly more complicated than just a few stolen thousands. This was a highly structured, deeply malicious financial conspiracy. Suddenly, the deafening silence of the empty house was violently shattered. The landline telephone sitting on the corner of the glass desk began to ring. The sharp, shrill sound made my heart leap in my chest. I did not move a single muscle. I watched the digital display flash with an unknown out-of-state number. It rang 4 times before the automated answering machine clicked on its robotic voice, echoing loudly in the quiet room. A sharp, aggressive voice filled the office. It was a man, and he was not calling to offer a friendly greeting. He stated that he was a representative from a high-level commercial collections agency. He loudly demanded to speak directly with Martin Lawson or his authorized financial representative, Derek Lawson. The man's voice grew increasingly hostile, warning that if the massive outstanding corporate debts were not satisfied by the end of the week, the agency would immediately file the legal paperwork to forcibly seize all available business assets and personal properties. The machine clicked off, returning the room to a heavy, suffocating silence. I stared at the blinking red light on the telephone. I looked down at the taped lease agreement for the brand new Porsche. Then I looked at the credit card statement showing the $13,000 Mediterranean cruise. The horrific, undeniable truth finally clicked into place. Their conspiracy was massive. I stood in the center of Derek's pristine home office for a few more seconds, letting the cold reality of their financial crimes settle deep into my bones. I swept the taped documents back into the plastic bin, locked the office door behind me, and moved quietly back to my truck. The drive home felt entirely different this time. There was no confusion left in my mind. There was no lingering parental doubt trying to justify my daughter's terrible actions. I now possessed hard, physical evidence that she and her husband were engaging in high-level financial fraud. The luxury lease agreement, the massive cruise receipt, and the aggressive collections voicemail were burned into my memory. It was all a calculated, deeply malicious deception. But before I completely dismantled their lives, before I unleashed the crushing weight of $120 million upon their fragile house of cards, I needed to perform one final definitive test. I needed to look past the stolen money and test the very core of Melissa's humanity. I needed to know if the little girl I had raised, the daughter I had loved and protected for 38 years, still existed somewhere beneath her thick layers of greed and entitlement. I parked my truck beneath the old oak tree and walked into my quiet kitchen. I sat down at the small kitchen table. I rested my hands on the smooth surface, staring blankly at the plastic landline telephone mounted on the faded wallpaper. I had owned that phone for 20 years. But today, picking it up felt like lifting a massive steel beam. I took a deep, steadying breath, mentally preparing myself for the hardest, most painful performance of my entire life. I closed my eyes and vividly remembered the terrifying sensation of the mild heart scare I had experienced 5 years ago. I remembered the tight, crushing pain in my chest, the sudden breathlessness, and the overwhelming fear of leaving Patricia behind. I channeled all of that lingering, buried panic directly into my vocal cords. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I let my hands shake slightly as I lifted the receiver and dialed Melissa's cell phone number. The line rang 3 times before she finally answered. I could hear the faint ambient noise of a high-end restaurant in the background, the soft clinking of silverware, and the low murmur of wealthy patrons. "Hello!" She answered, her tone clipped and slightly annoyed, as if my call was a tedious interruption to her afternoon. "Melissa," I said, my voice trembling and weak. I purposefully let out a strained, heavy breath. "Melissa, please, I need your help." The background noise on her end muffled slightly, telling me she had covered the receiver or stepped away from her table. "Dad, what is it? I am having a very important late lunch with Derek and some of his business associates. Make this quick." Her total lack of immediate concern stung, but I pressed forward with my calculated test. "I am so sorry to interrupt you, sweetheart, but I had a terrible dizzy spell at the grocery store. My chest felt incredibly tight, and I could barely stand up. The paramedics brought me over to the hospital." I paused, letting a pathetic, frightened quiver slip into my voice. "The doctors say I need to be hooked up to a specialized heart monitor immediately to check for any severe arterial blockages, but they need a $500 copay upfront before they can run the diagnostic tests." I took another ragged breath, gripping the edge of the kitchen table. "Melissa, they tried to run my debit card, but it was completely declined. I do not understand why, but I have absolutely no money in my checking account. Please, sweetheart. The chest pain is getting worse. Can you please lend me $500 just to cover the heart monitor?" I waited in the heavy, suffocating silence of my kitchen. I waited for the panic to set in. I waited for her to ask which hospital I was at, to tell me she was rushing over right away, to assure me that she would gladly pay whatever was necessary to make sure her father was safe. I waited for my daughter to show a single, solitary shred of basic human decency. Instead, a loud, deeply exasperated sigh echoed through the phone speaker. It was not a sigh of worry. It was a sigh of profound, unmasked inconvenience. "Dad, are you seriously doing this right now?" Melissa hissed, her voice dripping with pure frustration. "I specifically told you yesterday that we are completely broke. I explained to you that Derek and I are drowning in expenses. You need to stop relying on us to solve every single one of your problems." "But Melissa, it is my heart," I pleaded, letting a genuine tear of sorrow form in my eye, not for my physical health, but for the death of our relationship. "It is just $500. I promise I will pay you back as soon as my pension check clears next month." "No, Dad!" She snapped back, her tone turning ice cold and incredibly cruel. We simply cannot afford your medical bills right now. You are an adult, and you need to figure this out on your own. Go to the state-funded clinic across town and apply for Medicaid. They have to treat you if it is a real emergency. Do not call me again while I am working. Goodbye." The line went dead. A sharp, loud, and incredibly mechanical dial tone filled my right ear. I sat perfectly still for several long seconds, allowing the harsh sound to completely wash over me. I slowly pulled the receiver away from my head and gently placed it back onto the wall mount. The silence in my kitchen was no longer peaceful. It was devastatingly final. My own flesh and blood, the child I had sacrificed everything to raise, had just refused me a basic $500 medical payment, while she sat in an upscale restaurant likely sipping expensive wine purchased directly with the $45,000 she had stolen from my retirement fund. She had coldly instructed me to go stand in line at a low-income state clinic, while her father-in-law prepared to pack his bags for a luxurious $13,000 Mediterranean cruise. The father she knew, the quiet, forgiving man who always turned a blind eye to her immense selfishness, officially died during that terrible phone call. Any lingering hesitation I harbored was completely erased. I walked away from the kitchen wall and moved toward my wooden desk in the corner of the living room. I opened the drawer and pulled out my old leather-bound contact book. I flipped past the family pages, turning directly to the business section. I traced my finger down the worn page until I found a very specific name from my old corporate engineering days. I picked up my mobile phone and carefully dialed the number for Jonathan Bradley, the most ruthless financial attorney in the city. The drive into the downtown financial district took less than 40 minutes, but it felt like stepping into an entirely different universe. I navigated my rusted truck through the towering canyons of glass and steel, eventually pulling into the underground parking garage of the most prestigious corporate high-rise in the city. I stepped onto the private elevator and pressed the button for the 42nd floor. The doors slid open to reveal a sprawling reception area decorated in dark marble and brushed steel. I walked past the receptionist, ignoring her polite attempt to ask if I had an appointment. I knew exactly where I was going. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors leading into the corner office of Jonathan Bradley. Jonathan was a man who traded in corporate destruction. During my years as a structural engineer, I had consulted for him on several massive construction litigation cases. He was ruthless, highly efficient, and possessed an absolute lack of emotional sentimentality. That was exactly what I needed today. He looked up from his massive oak desk, his sharp gray eyes narrowing behind his silver-rimmed glasses. He was wearing a dark, tailored suit that probably cost more than my truck. He opened his mouth, likely prepared to scold me for the unannounced intrusion, but I did not give him the chance to speak. I walked straight across the plush carpet, reached into my chest pocket, and pulled out the crumpled $2 lottery ticket. I smoothed it out flat and placed it directly in the center of his immaculate desk. Next to it, I placed the printed bank statement, showing the empty balance of my joint retirement account, followed by the jagged taped-together lease agreement for the luxury sports car and the credit card receipt for the Mediterranean cruise. I sat down heavily in the leather chair opposite him. Jonathan looked annoyed for a fraction of a second before his trained eyes darted down to the colorful piece of cardboard. He leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. The annoyance on his face instantly melted into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He read the numbers. He read the prize amount. $120 million. The color completely drained from his usually composed face. He looked at the ticket, then looked up at me, and then back down at the ticket. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "William," he finally whispered, his voice completely stripped of its usual commanding authority. "Is this real? Are you sitting in my office with a verified winning lottery ticket worth $120 million? "It is completely real, Jonathan," I replied, my voice steady and cold. "But we are not going to talk about the money right now. We are going to talk about these other documents." He tore his eyes away from the massive fortune and looked at the bank statement and the taped-together receipts. I leaned forward, resting my calloused hands on the edge of his desk. I proceeded to tell him absolutely everything. I told him about the Father's Day dinner and the $13,000 vacation. I told him about the $45,000 systematically drained from my emergency funeral fund. I detailed my quiet investigation inside their home office, the shredded lease agreement for the Porsche registered under Martin Lawson's failing logistics company, and the aggressive voicemail from the commercial collections agency. I laid out the entire miserable, calculated betrayal with the clinical precision of a man describing a structural collapse. Jonathan listened in absolute silence. His shock over the lottery ticket was quickly replaced by the sharp, calculating focus of a predatory financial attorney. "I do not just want to claim this money and walk away," I stated firmly, pointing to the paperwork. "I want to initiate a full, aggressive forensic audit of Derek and Martin Lawson. I want to uncover every single hidden bank account, every offshore wire transfer, and every fraudulent corporate shell they have ever created. I want to know exactly how deep this financial conspiracy goes, and I want to dismantle it piece by piece." Jonathan leaned back in his heavy leather chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. The ruthless glint I remembered so well returned to his eyes. "We can absolutely tear their finances apart, William," Jonathan said smoothly. "But before we launch an attack, we have to completely secure your perimeter. If your daughter and her husband are bold enough to drain your retirement funds while simultaneously routing luxury car leases through a sinking corporation, they will stop at absolutely nothing if they find out you are suddenly worth over $100 million. We must shield this asset immediately." He pulled a legal pad toward him and uncapped a silver pen. "We are going to establish a blind trust," he explained, his voice returning to its normal rapid-fire cadence. "I will set up an impenetrable corporate entity. I will act as the legal executor to formally claim the lottery ticket on behalf of the trust. This ensures that the State Lottery Commission will never publicly release your name. The funds will be securely deposited into a private high-yield holding account. On paper, William Gallagher will remain a modest, retired engineer living on a fixed pension. No one, especially not your daughter or her husband, will legally know you are a billionaire. We will turn you into an absolute ghost." I nodded slowly, absorbing the brilliant tactical maneuver. It was the perfect defense. I would be completely insulated from their greed, standing invisible behind a massive wall of corporate anonymity, while I waged a silent war against their deception. "Set it up immediately," I instructed him. "I want the trust finalized today. Once the money is locked down, I want you to unleash your forensic accountants on Lawson Logistics. Find out exactly why Derek is funneling money into his father's bankrupt company." Jonathan stopped writing. He placed his silver pen deliberately onto the desk and looked me directly in the eyes. The predatory excitement in his demeanor shifted into something incredibly serious, almost solemn. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the glass. "William, I need you to listen to me very carefully." Jonathan warned, his tone heavy with legal caution. "I am the best at what I do. I will track every single cent that moved through their hands. But you need to understand the potential consequences of what you are asking me to do. If Martin Lawson is running a fraudulent corporate enterprise to dodge commercial collections, and your son-in-law is actively funneling stolen assets into that company, they are committing severe financial crimes. But the money they stole came from a joint account." He paused, letting the heavy reality of his words settle over the room. "If we dig deeply into Martin Lawson's corporate accounts, we might uncover a conspiracy that directly implicates your daughter. We might find things that will ultimately put her in a federal prison. Are you fully prepared for that?" I did not look away. I did not flinch at all. "Dig," I said, holding his gaze without hesitation. Jonathan nodded, picked up his pen, and his office shifted into high gear. For 24 hours, I was pulled into a whirlwind of corporate law. Jonathan sequestered us inside a windowless boardroom on the top floor. We were surrounded by legal documents and highly efficient paralegals. The first step was building the fortress to shield my wealth. We spent the morning drafting the complex articles of incorporation. I chose to name the blind trust after the only person who had never betrayed me. We established the Patricia Foundation Trust. Watching her name being typed onto the crisp parchment brought a sudden lump to my throat. It felt like she was standing right there offering her protection from beyond the grave. Once the structural framework was aligned, Jonathan brought in a private notary. We spent 3 hours signing ironclad non-disclosure agreements. Every person who touched my file was bound to absolute secrecy, facing financial ruin, if they ever breathed a word about my identity. When the ink was dry on the last page, the moment of truth arrived. I pulled out the crumpled $2 scratch-off ticket. I placed it into a security envelope and handed it to Jonathan. He left immediately, escorted by 2 armed security contractors, heading to the State Lottery Commission to formally claim the prize on behalf of the anonymous trust. I sat alone in that quiet boardroom for what felt like an eternity. My mind raced with the terrifying reality of what I was actually doing. I was an old, tired structural engineer who had lived his entire life adhering to a strict, predictable routine. Now I was orchestrating a massive financial operation designed to utterly destroy my own daughter and her arrogant husband. The guilt tried to creep back into my chest, whispering that perhaps I was going too far. But then I remembered the cold dial tone after Melissa refused to help me pay for a heart monitor. The guilt instantly vanished, replaced by a cold, unwavering resolve. 3 hours later, the heavy boardroom doors finally swung open. Jonathan walked back into the room. He did not say a word. He simply walked to the table, opened his briefcase, and placed a single piece of paper in front of me. It was an official wire transfer confirmation from the state treasury. The funds had been fully authenticated and successfully transferred. $120 million was now sitting securely inside a private holding account registered exclusively to the Patricia Foundation Trust. The money was completely and totally secured. No one would ever know that William Gallagher was a man of incomprehensible wealth. Jonathan walked over to a small wooden cabinet in the corner. He opened a bottle of sparkling water, poured 2 glasses, and handed one to me. We shared a quiet, deeply surreal moment of celebration. He looked at me with a genuine smile, telling me that my days of worrying about broken truck engines and modest pension checks were officially over. I took a slow sip of the cold water, feeling the crushing weight of financial anxiety finally lift off my weary shoulders. For the first time since Patricia passed away, I felt a genuine spark of hope for my future. But that fleeting moment of peace was violently shattered. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom suddenly burst open again. A younger man dressed in a slightly rumpled suit hurried into the room. This was David, Jonathan's lead forensic accountant. He looked incredibly stressed, his face pale and his breathing elevated. He was clutching a thick manila folder tightly against his chest. He did not even apologize for the abrupt interruption. He walked straight over to the mahogany table and dropped the heavy folder right next to my pristine wire transfer confirmation. "I am sorry to interrupt, Jonathan," David said, his voice tight with urgency. "But we have a massive escalating situation. I started running the preliminary financial traces on Derek Lawson and his wife exactly as you instructed. I began by pulling the historical data from the local bank branch where Mr. Gallagher held his joint emergency account. I was trying to map out the exact routing numbers for those specific wire transfers." Jonathan set his glass down, his professional demeanor instantly returning. "And what did you find, David?" "The $45,000 they drained from the retirement account was absolutely nothing," David replied, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. "That stolen cash was just literal pocket change compared to what they actually executed behind the scenes. They were using that money to cover the immediate closing costs for something significantly larger." My heart began to pound, a heavy, erratic rhythm against my ribs. I placed my glass down on the table, my hands suddenly feeling incredibly cold, filled with dense legal jargon and complex banking terminology. Jonathan leaned over the table, his sharp eyes quickly scanning the highlighted sections of the paperwork. I watched as his jaw tightened, the muscles in his face twitching with barely contained anger. Jonathan slowly reached across the table and placed his finger on a very specific document. He slid it gently across the smooth mahogany surface until it rested directly in front of me. "William," Jonathan said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerously quiet register. "They did not just drain your liquid cash. Look at your house." I looked down at the document. It was printed on the official letterhead of my local bank. I saw the legal registered description of my modest property, the exact plot of land where Patricia and I had planted our oak tree 40 years ago. And then my eyes locked onto the glaring, bolded numbers printed near the bottom of the page. It was a formal approval for a home equity line of credit. A loan taken out against the very roof over my head. The total approved amount was a staggering $200,000. The air was instantly sucked out of my lungs. My vision blurred for a fraction of a second. $200,000. They had secretly leveraged the entire financial value of my home, placing a massive, suffocating lien on the only sanctuary I had left in this world. If those monthly payments were not met, the bank would legally foreclose on the property and throw me out onto the street. My trembling eyes slowly dropped to the bottom right corner of the page, searching for the final authorization. There, on the designated signature line, was my name. William Gallagher. The cursive loops were incredibly neat, carefully constructed to closely mimic my own handwriting. But it was not my signature. I had never seen this document before in my life. I had never authorized a massive loan against my family home. It was a flawless, malicious forgery. My own daughter and her arrogant husband had forged my signature to steal $200,000, actively risking my absolute homelessness just to fund their elaborate, deceitful conspiracy. The heavy gray clouds that had been gathering all afternoon finally broke open just as I finished packing. I did not use a suitcase. A suitcase implies dignity. A suitcase implies a temporary visit. I wanted to present them with the absolute lowest and most desperate version of myself. I found a thick black plastic garbage bag in the kitchen pantry and stuffed it with my oldest, most frayed flannel shirts and a pair of worn-out denim jeans. I threw in a pair of scuffed, mud-stained boots for good measure. I tied a tight knot at the top of the bag. My legal team was already moving forward with the corporate takeover. But before I authorized Jonathan to completely dismantle their lives, I needed to look my daughter in the eye one final time. I needed to know beyond a shadow of a doubt that she possessed absolutely no remorse. I needed to give her one last opportunity to choose family over greed. I carried the plastic bag out to my truck. The rain was coming down in thick, freezing sheets, pounding relentlessly against the rusted hood. I drove across town through the storm, the rhythmic wiping of the blades doing very little to clear the blurry suburban streets. When I reached their neighborhood, the streetlights cast a cold, sterile glow against the wet pavement. I parked at the very edge of their pristine driveway, exactly where they always told me to park. I stepped out of the warm cab and deliberately left my umbrella behind. I let the freezing rain soak completely through my thin jacket. I wanted to look exactly like a man who had lost absolutely everything. I grabbed the black plastic bag from the passenger seat and walked slowly up the long, winding concrete path toward their towering front doors. The massive stone porch offered a small sliver of shelter, but I made sure to stand just at the edge, letting the freezing water drip heavily from my thinning hair and run rapidly down my face. I raised my cold, trembling fist and knocked loudly on the heavy mahogany door. I waited for almost a full minute, shivering violently in the dark, before the heavy brass lock finally clicked. The door swung inward. Derek stood in the grand entryway, bathed in the warm, golden light of their expensive crystal chandelier. He was wearing plush luxury slippers and a dark silk robe. His expression immediately soured the second his arrogant eyes landed on my soaking wet clothes. He did not step aside to let me in. He stood firmly in the center of the doorway, using his physical body to completely block the entrance. I hunched my shoulders forward, dropping my gaze to the floor, to put on a masterful performance of a broken, defeated old man. I forced my voice to crack with deep, agonizing despair. I looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. I told him that I had made a terrible, irreversible mistake. I stammered out a fabricated story, claiming that I had been targeted by a sophisticated telephone scam earlier that very morning. I told him my bank account was completely empty. Then I delivered the final devastating blow. I told him that the bank had just contacted me about a massive loan I never knew existed, and they had officially foreclosed on my house. I let a genuine sob tear painfully through my throat. I told him I was completely ruined, that I had absolutely nowhere else to go in the entire world, and I begged him to please let me stay in their guest room for just a few nights until I could figure things out. Derek stared at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. He did not offer a single word of comfort. He did not show an ounce of human empathy. He simply scoffed, crossing his arms tightly over his silk robe. A moment later, I heard the rapid clicking of footsteps approaching from the hallway. Melissa appeared behind her husband. She was wearing a matching silk robe holding a delicate glass of red wine. She looked over Derek's shoulder, her eyes sweeping over my drenched clothes and the pathetic plastic garbage bag resting by my wet boots. She did not gasp in horror. She did not rush forward to pull her freezing father into the warmth of her home. Instead, her face hardened into a mask of supreme annoyance. She stepped up to stand directly beside Derek, perfectly aligned with him in blocking the entrance to their home. Her voice was sharp and entirely devoid of any familial warmth. She reminded me angrily that she had just told me yesterday how broke they were. She stated firmly that they did not have any space for me. She declared that Martin was coming to stay in the guest room next week to prepare for his European cruise, and they could not possibly have me crowding the house and ruining his relaxation. She looked me dead in the eye and said that her beautiful home was not a homeless shelter. Before I could even formulate a response to her breathtaking cruelty, Derek shifted his weight. He lifted his foot and kicked my plastic garbage bag hard. It tumbled off the edge of the stone porch and landed with a heavy splash right in the middle of a muddy puddle in their manicured flower bed. I stood perfectly still on the edge of the porch, the freezing rain continuing to beat down on my shoulders. I looked at the muddy plastic bag, and then I looked back at my only child. There was no hesitation in her eyes, no lingering guilt about turning her supposedly bankrupt, homeless father out into a brutal storm. She simply sighed as if dealing with me was the most exhausting chore in the world. She reached a hand into the pocket of her expensive robe. She pulled out a small, glossy pamphlet and held it out toward me. I reached out with a trembling hand and took it from her fingers. The paper was thick and smooth. She did not offer a hug. She did not offer a warm cup of coffee. She looked down her nose at me, her expression, a perfect portrait of wealthy entitlement. She told me that I needed to stop acting like a victim and take responsibility for my own foolish mistakes. She pointed a manicured finger at the pamphlet in my hand. She explained that the facility listed on the cover took in bankrupt seniors who relied entirely on government subsidies. I stared blankly at the colorful cover of the glossy brochure as the relentless downpour quickly soaked the expensive, heavy cardstock. I realized in that freezing moment they had completely stripped away any remaining trace of their humanity. Their immense cruelty was entirely deliberate. She told me to call them in the morning and sort myself out. Then, without another word, Derek slammed the heavy mahogany door squarely in my face. The deadbolt clicked loudly. I stood alone in the dark, the cold rain washing away the last remaining traces of my paternal mercy. The heavy mahogany door, slamming shut, sent a sharp, painful echo through the freezing rain. I stood on this porch for several long moments, the icy water cascading down my neck, completely soaking through my ragged flannel shirt. The cold was biting, but it was absolutely nothing compared to the profound, terrifying ice settling deep within my chest. I turned around and walked slowly back toward my old, rusted pickup truck. My boots squelched heavily in the wet mud, stepping right past the black garbage bag that Derek had so casually kicked off the pristine concrete. Climbed into the driver's seat, my stiff, freezing fingers fumbling with the keys before I finally managed to start the engine. The heater roared to life, blowing warm air against my shivering hands, but the chill had already reached my bones. I reached up and pressed the button for the small overhead dome light. The dim yellow glow illuminated the cab of my truck. In my right hand, I was still tightly gripping the glossy pamphlet Melissa had just handed to me. The rainwater had smeared some of the ink on the edges, but the bold, cheerful letters printed across the front cover were still perfectly legible. I wiped a cold drop of water from my eye and focused my tired vision on the thick cardstock. She had explicitly told me it was a government-subsidized shelter for bankrupt seniors. She had presented it as a harsh but necessary reality check for a father who had foolishly lost all of his money. But as I read the actual words printed beneath the smiling stock photo of an elderly couple, a profound, suffocating sense of dread began to crawl rapidly up my throat. The facility was named Shady Pines. It was not a low-income housing project. It was not a charitable shelter for the financially destitute. I knew exactly what Shady Pines was. Anyone who had lived in this county for more than a decade knew its remarkably dark reputation. It was a notorious, heavily fortified, state-run psychiatric lockdown facility. It was specifically designated for wards of the state who were suffering from severe late-stage dementia and aggressive cognitive decline. It was a bleak, terrifying place where people with no advocates and no memory were sent to simply fade away behind locked metal doors and reinforced glass windows. I opened the damp pamphlet, my hands shaking so violently that I nearly tore the heavy paper right down the middle. My engineering mind, trained to process strict logic and spatial reasoning, struggled to comprehend the sheer terrifying magnitude of what I was reading. The brochure detailed their highly secure memory care wings, their rigorous 24-hour surveillance protocols, and their heavy chemical restraint policies. Why on earth would my only daughter hand me a brochure for a locked dementia ward? I did not have dementia. My mind was exactly as sharp as the heavy steel beams I used to meticulously inspect during my career. I had just navigated my truck across town in the middle of a brutal thunderstorm. I had perfectly articulated a complex, fabricated story about a bank foreclosure and a vicious telephone scam. There was absolutely nothing about my current behavior that suggested any form of cognitive decline. The horrific realization hit me with the overwhelming force of a physical blow. The blood in my veins ran completely cold, freezing me in the driver's seat. This was not a careless, random mistake. Melissa was a highly educated, meticulously organized corporate manager. She did not accidentally grab a psychiatric brochure instead of a homeless shelter pamphlet. She had purposefully researched this specific, highly restrictive facility. She had kept their glossy promotional material ready in her expensive designer purse. She had handed it to me as a deliberate, calculated threat, or perhaps as a terrifying preview of what she had already set into motion behind my back. My breathing became incredibly shallow and fast. The tight enclosed space of the truck cab suddenly felt like a shrinking, inescapable cage. I reached into my dry inner jacket pocket and pulled out my mobile phone. My fingers were stiff and incredibly clumsy, but I managed to navigate to my secure contact list. I pressed the call button for Jonathan Bradley. It was incredibly late on a Sunday evening, but I simply did not care. A man like Jonathan was always working, always connected to the shifting, dangerous currents of his clients' lives. The line rang twice before he answered. His voice was sharp, crisp, and incredibly alert, showing absolutely no signs of sleep. I did not bother with polite pleasantries. I told him exactly where I was currently parked and exactly what had just transpired on my daughter's stone porch. I described the garbage bag, Derek's unprovoked physical aggression, and Melissa's cold, calculated rejection. Then I told him about the glossy pamphlet I was currently holding under the dim yellow truck light. I read the exact name of the facility aloud: Shady Pines Psychiatric and Memory Care Center. The very moment I spoke the specific name of the lockdown facility, the telephone line went completely silent. I could hear the faint, incredibly rapid clicking of a computer keyboard on Jonathan's end. He was typing frantically, his heavy keystrokes echoing with a sudden, deeply aggressive urgency. The heavy silence stretched on for what felt like an absolute eternity. I sat completely frozen in the cold truck, listening to the heavy rain hammer relentlessly against the metal roof, waiting for my attorney to process the terrifying piece of evidence I had just handed him. The frantic clicking stopped abruptly. I heard Jonathan let out a slow, incredibly heavy breath. When he finally spoke, his normal, highly confident corporate tone was entirely gone. His voice was low, exceptionally tight, and filled with a stark, undeniable sense of absolute alarm. He did not ask me for any more details. He did not offer a comforting legal platitude to calm my nerves. He issued a direct, uncompromising command. William, get out of your house immediately. Do not go back to sleep there tonight. Do not pack any bags. Just drive away and find a secure, anonymous hotel on the exact opposite side of the city right now. My heart slammed violently against my ribs. I asked him what he had found, my voice cracking painfully under the sudden surge of absolute terror. Jonathan paused for just a fraction of a second before delivering the final fatal blow. They are not just trying to steal your money, William. They are trying to erase you completely. I just accessed the hidden county court docket filings. First thing tomorrow morning, your daughter is presenting a closed petition to a judge. They have filed formal legal paperwork to declare you mentally incompetent. They are going to argue that your mind is completely gone. Use this exact facility to lock you away behind closed doors and assume total legal control over your entire life. Start the truck engine and drive away, right this very exact second, before they send someone out into the storm to forcibly collect you and drag you away forever. I did not ask any questions. My foot slammed down on the accelerator, and the heavy tires of my old truck spun against the wet pavement before catching traction. I tore out of the wealthy suburban neighborhood, leaving the manicured lawns and the looming threat of my daughter's betrayal far behind me. The rain continued to batter the windshield in relentless waves, but the icy panic gripping my chest kept my eyes wide open and focused on the dark road ahead. I drove aimlessly for an hour, navigating through twisting back roads to ensure no one was following me. My mobile phone rested on the passenger seat, connected to a secure line Jonathan had established. He directed me to a high-end, discreet hotel located on the opposite side of the city, far away from any jurisdiction where Melissa might hold influence. He had booked an anonymous suite under a corporate shell name and told me he would meet me there with the physical files. When I finally pulled into the heavily guarded underground parking garage of the hotel, my hands were still shaking. I took a private service elevator up to the top floor, clutching my soaked jacket around my freezing shoulders. I walked down the quiet carpeted hallway and knocked softly on the door of the corner suite. Jonathan opened it immediately. He had shed his demeanor. His tie was loosened, his sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, and his eyes burned with a fierce, predatory intensity. The massive suite was transformed into a makeshift war room. Stacks of court filings, banking records, and legal briefs were spread meticulously across the large glass dining table. He locked the deadbolt behind me and directed me toward a plush armchair. He handed me a hot cup of black coffee, but I could not drink it. My stomach was twisting into knots. I sat down and looked at the mountain of paperwork that detailed my own attempted destruction. Jonathan did not waste time with comforting platitudes. He walked directly to the center of the table and picked up a thick stack of stapled documents. He placed them down right in front of me and tapped his index finger against the top page. It was a formal petition filed in the county probate court, stamped with an emergency processing seal. I read the bold text at the top of the page. It was a comprehensive medical proxy claim actively seeking a permanent conservatorship over my entire life. Melissa had submitted a sworn, legally binding affidavit to a judge, completely fabricating a devastating medical narrative. She claimed, under penalty of perjury, that I was suffering from rapid severe Alzheimer's disease. She wrote that my cognitive decline had become incredibly aggressive and entirely unmanageable. She stated that I was a physical danger to myself and others, prone to violent outbursts and deep, terrifying delusions. I stared at the black ink detailing the fictional deterioration of my mind. It was a masterful, deeply sinister piece of legal fiction. I looked up at Jonathan, struggling to push the words past the lump in my throat. I asked him why she would go to such extreme lengths. Jonathan pulled out the second piece of the puzzle. It was a clear copy of the $200,000 home equity line of credit taken out against my house. He placed the two documents side by side, connecting the malicious dots with terrifying clarity. He explained their master plan. Melissa and Derek had forged my signature to steal $200,000 against the equity of my home. They took the maximum allowable amount, knowing perfectly well that the monthly repayment schedule was impossible for a retired engineer on a fixed pension to afford. They deliberately planned for the loan to enter a state of severe default. They knew the bank would eventually initiate a hostile foreclosure and seize the property. My daughter is highly intelligent, and she knew I would eventually receive the foreclosure notices in the mail. She knew I would discover the massive loan, realize my signature had been completely forged, and immediately go to the police to report the staggering financial crime. She needed an ironclad method to permanently silence me before I could ever expose her theft. That was the exact purpose of the medical proxy claim. By legally declaring me mentally incompetent and branding me with a severe dementia diagnosis, she completely invalidated any future testimony I might give. If I went to the authorities claiming my daughter forged a $200,000 loan, the police would simply look at the court order, see my fabricated Alzheimer's diagnosis, and dismiss my desperate pleas as the sad, confused ramblings of a dying man who had simply forgotten he signed the papers. Jonathan leaned over the table, his voice dropping into a harsh whisper. He explained the final, most agonizing phase of their plan. Once the judge officially signed the conservatorship order on Monday morning, Melissa would be granted total legal authority over my physical body and my remaining assets. She was fully prepared to use that immense power to forcibly commit me to Shady Pines. She handed me that glossy brochure on the porch, not as a threat, but as a twisted, arrogant preview of my new permanent residence. She was going to have me dragged away and locked inside a heavily sedated psychiatric ward until the day I died. Once I was safely disposed of behind reinforced doors, she would smoothly manage the foreclosure of my house, legally burying the forged loan under a mountain of tragic medical expenses. She would completely cover her tracks, secure the stolen money, and walk away looking like a deeply devoted, grieving daughter who had made the hardest possible choice for her ailing father. The sheer magnitude of her cruelty washed over me in cold, suffocating waves. I sat in the silent hotel suite staring down at my forged signature and the completely fabricated medical records. The daughter I had raised, the little girl I had protected and provided for, had meticulously planned to strip away my fundamental human rights. She was entirely willing to condemn me to a chemical prison, to let me rot away in terrifying isolation, all to cover up a financial crime. The profound, unconditional fatherly affection that had guided my entire life quietly shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The man who had walked into that hotel suite was a grieving father looking for answers. The man who sat looking at those documents was something else entirely. I felt a sudden, terrifying sense of absolute calm settle over my mind. The rising panic quickly evaporated. The fear was completely gone. I slowly pushed the medical proxy petition across the glass table. I looked up at Jonathan, my voice devoid of any warmth or hesitation. "Tell me, where exactly did the $200,000 go?" Jonathan reached into the thick manila folder, pulled out a complex financial flow chart, and slid it across the glass table. He traced his finger along the exact path of my stolen home equity. The $200,000 did not stay in Derek and Melissa's personal checking account. It was parked there for less than 24 hours before being wired directly into a corporate holding account registered to Lawson Logistics. That was the very same company name I had seen on the shredded lease agreement for the luxury sports car. Jonathan looked at me with a grim, humorless expression. He explained that Martin Lawson was not just a failing businessman suffering from a bout of depression. Martin was a prolific, desperate corporate fraudster, running an illegal Ponzi scheme for the better part of the last decade. My mind reeled as Jonathan laid out the horrifying mechanics of their financial conspiracy. Martin had built his entire logistics empire on a foundation of lies, securing millions of dollars in commercial loans by presenting completely fabricated revenue reports to aggressive, highly dangerous private lenders. But the scheme had finally collapsed. The fresh investment capital had dried up, and his predatory creditors were demanding immediate repayment. Martin was facing absolute financial ruin and potentially violent retaliation from the people he had defrauded. He needed untraceable cash to placate his most aggressive creditors and buy a small window of time. Derek stepped in to save his father using the $200,000 he stole from the equity of my home. They funneled a massive corporate investment directly into Martin's shell company. They effectively washed my stolen home equity through a series of fake vendor invoices, turning my life savings into clean cash to keep Martin's angry creditors at bay. I sat back in the plush armchair, feeling a sickening wave of revulsion wash over me. My daughter and her husband had actively committed mortgage fraud, identity theft, and severe elder abuse to facilitate a massive money laundering operation for a corporate criminal. But the sheer depth of their malicious deception did not stop there. Jonathan pulled another piece of paper from his file. It was a detailed background check on the specific European cruise line that Melissa had proudly presented at the Father's Day dinner. Jonathan tapped the paper, his voice completely devoid of any emotion. He told me to look very closely at the specific itinerary of the luxury cruise. I scanned the glossy port destinations printed on the page. The cruise departed from a domestic port, but its final destination was a small, independent Mediterranean country that possessed absolutely no formal extradition treaty with the United States government. The horrific truth finally clicked into place. The $13,000 luxury vacation was not a heartfelt gift purchased to save a depressed father. It was a highly calculated one-way escape ticket. Martin Lawson was actively planning to permanently flee the country. He was going to quietly slip away to a safe non-extradition zone far beyond the legal reach of the authorities and his defrauded creditors. And his luxurious escape was being funded entirely by the stolen equity of my family home. The scale of their arrogance was paralyzing. They were orchestrating an international criminal escape, using my physical home and my mental freedom as the sacrificial collateral. I looked down at the forged medical proxy documents still sitting on the glass table. The timeline of their conspiracy became terrifyingly clear. Today was Thursday. Sunday afternoon was the lavish catered bon voyage party they were hosting in their pristine backyard to celebrate Martin's departure. And Monday morning was the scheduled emergency court hearing where Melissa would present my fabricated dementia diagnosis and gain the absolute legal authority to lock me inside Shady Pines forever. They had perfectly timed every single phase of my destruction. By the time I was heavily sedated behind the reinforced doors of a psychiatric lockdown ward, on Monday afternoon, Martin Lawson would be sailing smoothly across international waters. Melissa and Derek would legally sell my foreclosed house to cover their fraudulent tracks, using my supposed medical expenses as the tragic excuse for my sudden financial ruin. They truly believed they had accounted for every single variable. They had absolutely no idea that the silent old man they were actively trying to bury was currently sitting inside a secure hotel suite, commanding an aggressive legal strike team and holding a verified fortune of $120 million. A profound, icy calm completely enveloped my mind. The grief of losing my daughter was entirely gone, replaced by an unyielding determination to dismantle their fragile empire. I did not want to simply go to the police and file a standard criminal report. I did not want to sit in a crowded courtroom for years, waiting for a sluggish justice system to slowly sort through their financial fraud. A simple prison sentence was far too easy for the level of cruelty they had displayed. I wanted them to feel the exact same overwhelming, suffocating terror they had so casually planned for me. I wanted to systematically strip away every single piece of their comfortable lives until they had absolutely nothing left but the devastating consequences of their own boundless greed. I looked across the glass table at Jonathan. He was watching me intently, waiting for my final directive. I leaned forward, resting my hands firmly on top of the forged medical documents. My voice was perfectly steady, carrying the heavy, immovable weight of absolute authority. "Jonathan," I said quietly, the cold determination resonating through every single syllable. "I do not want you to just report them to the authorities. I want you to completely leverage the unlimited resources of the blind trust. Contact Martin Lawson's most aggressive commercial creditors immediately. Offer them a massive premium to purchase his outstanding corporate debt. I want you to contact my local bank and aggressively buy out the specific $200,000 line of credit they took out against my property. And I want you to initiate a hostile takeover of Lawson Logistics. Purchase every single compromised shell company he owns." Jonathan's eyes widened slightly, a rare display of genuine surprise from the seasoned attorney. He slowly nodded his head, a fierce predatory smile beginning to form on his face as he fully grasped the sheer magnitude of my tactical maneuver. I leaned back in my chair. "The court hearing for my mental incompetency is scheduled for Monday morning," I continued, my voice echoing in the quiet suite. "The lavish farewell party for Martin is scheduled for Sunday afternoon. We have exactly 72 hours to execute this operation. I do not want to just stop them, Jonathan. Buy Martin's debt. Buy the home equity line of credit from the bank. Buy the shell company. I want to own every single breath they take. They believed they could throw me away like garbage in the freezing rain, completely erasing my existence to fund their luxurious criminal escape. But they are about to learn a very painful lesson about the old man they tried to bury. We will take absolutely everything back." Jonathan did not waste a single second. He immediately summoned his entire team of corporate litigators and forensic accountants back into the hotel suite. The room transformed from a quiet meeting space into a highly aggressive financial command center. I sat right back and watched a masterclass in corporate warfare. When you possess a verified liquid asset pool of $120 million, the heavy, bureaucratic doors of the financial world suddenly swing wide open with breathtaking speed. The impossible suddenly becomes a simple matter of wire transfers and signed contracts. Jonathan bypassed the standard legal channels and went directly to the executive decision-makers. He understood that time was our most critical asset, and he utilized the trust's massive capital to leverage immediate compliance. His first target was my own local bank. He contacted the regional vice president and negotiated a direct immediate buyout of the $200,000 home equity line of credit that Melissa and Derek had fraudulently opened against my property. The bank, eager to clear a very high-risk defaulting asset from their books, eagerly accepted the massive premium Jonathan offered from the blind trust. Within a matter of hours, the bank transferred the physical deed and the holding rights of the loan directly to my foundation. I officially became my own ultimate creditor. No one could ever foreclose on my house because I now owned the very debt that threatened it. That single maneuver completely neutralized their leverage over my home, but we were only just getting started. The next 48 hours were a chaotic blur of ruthless, calculated acquisitions. Jonathan systematically tracked down the specific private commercial lenders who held the massive toxic debts for Lawson Logistics. These were dangerous, impatient creditors who were incredibly eager to offload Martin Lawson's failing portfolio. They did not ask questions about the anonymous trust purchasing the debt. They only cared that the funds cleared their accounts instantly. Jonathan used the unlimited, untraceable capital of the blind trust to aggressively purchase every single outstanding commercial note. He bought the primary shell company. He bought the operational liens on their equipment. He even tracked down the specific luxury automotive leasing agency in the city and executed an immediate full-cash buyout of the contract for the brand-new Porsche that Derek was proudly driving. Every single financial chain that bound Martin and Derek to the outside world was systematically severed and rerouted directly into my hands. By Saturday afternoon, the dust had completely settled in the hotel suite. The legal paperwork was finalized, stamped and stacked neatly on the glass table in front of me. On paper, Martin Lawson and Derek Lawson believed they were successfully dodging their financial ruin through clever money laundering. In reality, the Patricia Foundation Trust now legally owned every single aspect of their material existence. I held the absolute unchecked power to seize their vehicles, liquidate their corporate assets, and completely bankrupt their future with a single phone call. I owned their debt, which meant I owned their freedom. As I sat reviewing the final corporate transfer documents, my mobile phone began to vibrate violently against the glass table. I looked at the illuminated screen. It was Melissa. My heart remained perfectly steady. The old familiar urge to answer the phone and seek my daughter's approval was completely dead. I simply watched the screen flash until the call went unanswered and automatically forwarded to my messaging system. A minute later, a small notification chimed, indicating a new voicemail had been left. I picked up the black device, placed the phone on speaker, and maximized the volume so Jonathan and his entire legal team could hear every single word. The audio crackled for a second, and before Melissa's voice filled the quiet hotel suite. She was not using the sharp, impatient tone she had used on the porch in the freezing rain. Instead, she had adopted a sickeningly sweet, incredibly gentle cadence. It was the exact, patronizing tune a person uses when speaking to a small, confused child or a dying animal. It was a chilling reminder of how effortlessly she could slip into the role of a devoted, caring daughter when it suited her narrative. She told me that she loved me deeply and that she had been worrying about my declining health all week. She said she had noticed I was becoming increasingly confused and erratic, and she just wanted to help me get better. Then she delivered the final, chilling instruction. She cheerfully announced that she had arranged for a private medical transport to arrive at my house first thing Monday morning. She claimed the ambulance was going to take me to a very nice specialized clinic out in the country where doctors could help clear my mind and keep me safe. She ended the message by softly urging me not to fight the paramedics, insisting that this lockdown facility was entirely for my own good and promising she would visit me as soon as I was comfortably settled. The voicemail clicked off, leaving a heavy, disgusted silence in the hotel suite. Her performance was an absolute masterpiece of emotional manipulation and premeditated elder abuse. She truly believed her sinister plan was working perfectly. She thought she was smoothly guiding a mentally vacant, defenseless old man directly into a permanent, heavily sedated psychiatric prison. She believed that by Monday afternoon, my entire existence would be quietly swept under the rug, leaving her free to enjoy her stolen riches. I did not feel sorrow. I felt a cold, righteous anger burning deep in my chest. I carefully saved the digital audio file and immediately emailed a secure copy directly to Jonathan's encrypted server. He printed a physical transcription of the threatening message and placed it precisely at the very top of our towering mountain of physical evidence. We now possessed a comprehensive, undeniable paper trail documenting massive financial fraud, felony forgery, grand larceny, and a highly coordinated malicious conspiracy to commit severe elder abuse. Jonathan pulled a thick stack of formal criminal complaints from his leather briefcase. He aligned the pages and handed me a black fountain pen. I read through the official charges, my eyes scanning the severe legal consequences that were about to rain down upon my own flesh and blood. I simply did not hesitate for even a fraction of a second. I pressed the heavy pen against the paper and signed my name on every single line with strong, unwavering precision. I signed away her freedom forever. I signed away Derek's boundless arrogance. I signed away Martin's luxurious international escape. Jonathan gathered the executed documents and locked them securely inside his briefcase. The massive legal trap was now fully constructed, baited, and armed. There was absolutely nothing left for us to do but wait quietly for the sun to rise. Tomorrow afternoon was the scheduled lavish catered bon voyage party for Martin Lawson. Tomorrow they would proudly raise their expensive crystal glasses and celebrate their stolen wealth in front of all their high society friends. And tomorrow I would confidently walk right through their imposing front gates and burn their entire empire to the ground. Sunday morning arrived with a bright, blinding sunlight that felt almost incredibly ironic considering the dark, devastating storm I was about to bring down upon my own family. I woke up early in my secure hotel suite, my mind perfectly sharp and completely devoid of any lingering paternal hesitation. For my entire adult life, I had dressed for utility and hard labor. My closet had always consisted of faded flannel shirts, durable denim jeans, and heavy, steel-toed work boots covered in construction dust. I had always taken immense pride in the simple, honest humility of my wardrobe. But today was not a day for humility. Today was a day for absolute, uncompromising authority. I picked up the telephone and contacted a high-end personal concierge service that Jonathan had highly recommended. Within 3 hours, a private tailor arrived directly at my hotel suite with a selection of garments that cost more than I used to earn in an entire year. I stood in front of the full-length mirror and systematically shed the battered, exhausted exterior of the vulnerable old man my daughter thought she had so easily defeated. I stepped into a meticulously tailored bespoke Italian suit woven from deep charcoal wool. The fabric draped perfectly over my shoulders, instantly transforming my posture. I slipped on a crisp, brilliant white dress shirt and fastened a dark silk tie. The tailor brought out a velvet display case containing several luxury timepieces. I selected a sleek, heavy platinum watch, encrusted with subtle, flawless diamonds along the bezel. I clasped it onto my wrist, feeling the cold, substantial weight of undeniable financial power against my skin. I looked at my reflection and barely recognized the man staring back at me. The tired, grieving widower who had stood shivering in the freezing rain on a stone porch was completely gone. In his place stood an extremely wealthy, highly dangerous adversary who was fully prepared to exact a precise, calculated measure of total financial ruin. At exactly 1 in this afternoon, today my mobile phone chimed with a brief encrypted message from Jonathan. I adjusted my suit jacket, stepped out of my suite, and took the private elevator down to the secure underground parking garage. When the heavy metal doors slid open, I was greeted by a sight that sent a powerful surge of cold adrenaline rushing straight through my veins. 2 massive, entirely unmarked black SUVs with heavily tinted windows were parked side by side near the exit ramp. The engines were idling with a low, intimidating hum. Jonathan was standing between the 2 imposing vehicles dressed in his usual immaculate corporate armor, holding a thick leather briefcase packed tightly with our devastating legal arsenal. As I approached, the tinted windows of the vehicles rolled down, revealing the highly specialized tactical strike team Jonathan had assembled using the unlimited capital of the Blind Trust. Inside the first vehicle sat 3 off-duty county sheriffs, fully uniformed and legally authorized to execute the necessary property seizures and maintain absolute civil order. Inside the second vehicle sat 2 seasoned, sharp-eyed, white-collar fraud investigators, individuals whose entire careers were dedicated to dismantling complex financial laundering schemes and corporate embezzlement operations. Jonathan stepped forward and handed me a thick, consolidated dossier. He spoke in a low, rapid-fire cadence, meticulously reviewing the exact chronological timeline of our impending strike. We confirmed the execution of the primary asset seizures, verifying that my trust now held the absolute legal deeds to Martin Lawson's corporate debt, the direct lease agreement for Derek's luxury sports car, and the specific home equity line of credit that completely controlled my own personal property. We established the precise order of operations. The sheriffs would secure the perimeter and prevent any immediate flight risks. The fraud investigators would serve the formal seizure notices directly to Derek and Martin, simultaneously locking down their personal assets. Jonathan would personally deliver the crushing legal reality of their complete bankruptcy, while I stood as the silent, unyielding architect of their total destruction. I nodded my head once, confirming that I fully understood the plan. I climbed into the spacious back seat of the lead SUV, sitting shoulder to shoulder with Jonathan, and we smoothly exited the dark parking garage into the bright afternoon sunlight. The drive toward the affluent suburban neighborhood was executed in absolute unbroken silence. The heavy armored vehicle glided effortlessly down the highway, carrying a payload of impending doom for the people who had so casually discarded my life. When we finally turned onto their familiar tree-lined street, I could immediately see the overwhelming scale of their grotesque celebration. Luxury vehicles were parked tightly along both sides of the road for nearly an entire block. We pulled our massive black SUVs right up to the very edge of their property, parking directly across the street from their towering wrought iron driveway gates. I sat quietly in the back seat, peering through the dark-tinted glass at the lavish spectacle unfolding before me. The sprawling manicured backyard was completely filled with the arrogant, self-important chatter of 50 of their snobbiest, most affluent friends. Waiters dressed in crisp white uniforms circulated smoothly through the crowd, carrying silver trays completely loaded with expensive appetizers. A massive, multi-tiered champagne fountain bubbled cheerfully in the center of the patio, overflowing with expensive, sparkling wine purchased directly with the stolen equity of my family home. The breathtaking arrogance of their stolen luxury made blood pound fiercely in my ears. Through the thick glass of the SUV, I watched Martin Lawson step confidently up to a small, elevated wooden podium positioned near the edge of the sparkling swimming pool. I was holding a delicate crystal flute high in the air, a wide, victorious smile plastered across his face. He tapped a silver spoon against the glass, demanding the rapt attention of his wealthy audience. I rolled the window down just a few inches, allowing his booming, boastful voice to drift across the street. He was actively giving a grand, incredibly arrogant toast, loudly celebrating his highly successful business expansion into lucrative overseas markets, completely unaware that his so-called expansion was nothing more than an illegal international escape attempt, funded by severe elder abuse. I watched Melissa and Derek standing proudly in the front row, beaming with false pride and sipping their stolen champagne. They looked so incredibly comfortable, so entirely secure in their impenetrable fortress of deceit. They believed the vulnerable old man they had thrown out into the rain was currently wandering the streets or slowly decaying in a locked dementia ward. I reached over and firmly grasped the heavy chrome handle of the SUV door. I took a deep breath, feeling the absolute terrifying power of the $120 million resting silently behind my name. I pulled the handle and pushed the door open. I stepped out of the vehicle, my custom Italian leather shoes planting firmly onto the pavement. I adjusted my suit jacket, checked the brilliant diamond watch on my wrist, and began walking slowly and deliberately toward the heavy iron gates that were just beginning to swing open. I walked through the heavy wrought iron gates just as they swung inward to accommodate a catering van. The security guard hired for the afternoon barely gave me a second glance. The immaculate charcoal wool of my bespoke suit and the quiet confidence in my stride acted as an absolute shield. In this affluent suburban neighborhood, wealth was the ultimate passkey, and I was currently radiating an undeniable aura of immense financial power. I bypassed the main entrance of the house entirely. Following the curved stone pathway that hugged the side of the massive property. The sounds of the celebration grew louder with every measured step I took. I could hear the upbeat tempo of a live jazz quartet, drifting through the warm afternoon air, mingling perfectly with the bright artificial laughter of 50 high society guests. The scent of roasted meats and expensive floral arrangements hung heavily around me. I reached the tall wooden privacy fence that enclosed the sprawling backyard and pushed open the decorative latch. I stepped onto the pristine green lawn. The scene before me was a grotesque monument to their boundless arrogance. A towering, multi-tiered champagne fountain bubbled flawlessly in the very center of the stone patio, reflecting the golden sunlight. Waiters in crisp white uniforms glided effortlessly through the crowd of well-dressed guests, offering silver trays loaded with delicate appetizers. No one noticed me at first. I was just an old man standing quietly at the edge of the vibrant garden. I took a moment to simply observe the people who had casually financed their luxury with my stolen funeral funds. Near the sparkling blue waters of the swimming pool, Martin Lawson stood elevated on a small wooden platform. He was holding a delicate crystal flute high above his head. His face was flushed with the intoxicating thrill of his own deceit. He was loudly regaling the captivated audience with a fabricated tale of his impending European expansion. He boasted about conquering new international markets and securing incredible overseas investments. Every single word spilling from his mouth was a calculated lie designed specifically to mask his desperate, cowardly escape to a non-extradition zone. I watched Melissa and Derek standing proudly in the front row. Melissa was wearing a stunning pearl-white designer dress that likely cost more than the average monthly mortgage payment. Derek had his arm wrapped tightly around her waist, nodding along to his father's magnificent speech. They looked incredibly secure, completely convinced that their malicious conspiracy had been executed flawlessly. They truly believed I was currently locked inside a barren room, slowly losing my mind under heavy sedation. I did not rush forward. I did not shout to interrupt the festivities. I simply continued my slow, methodical march directly toward the center of the patio. My leather shoes clicked firmly against the smooth stone tiles. One of the waiters turned, nearly bumping into my shoulder, and abruptly stopped in his tracks. The sudden movement caught the attention of the jazz quartet. The saxophone player lowered his instrument, his eyes fixed curiously on my unfamiliar presence. Within seconds, the upbeat music awkwardly sputtered to a complete halt. The sudden, jarring absence of music caused a ripple of confusion to spread rapidly through the affluent crowd. Dozens of heads turned simultaneously, following the gaze of the silent musicians. The quiet murmurs of conversation died away, replaced by a tense, suffocating silence that swallowed the entire garden. I walked right into the very center of the patio and stopped. I stood perfectly still, allowing the afternoon sun to highlight the flawless tailoring of my $5,000 suit and the brilliant sparkle of the diamond watch on my wrist. Martin lowered his crystal flute, his grand speech dying instantly in his throat. In the front row, Melissa finally turned around to see what had interrupted the celebration. Her eyes locked onto my face. The color drained from her cheeks with such terrifying speed that she looked as though she had seen a literal ghost. Her jaw fell open. The delicate champagne glass slipped right through her trembling fingers. It hit the stone patio with a sharp, violent crash, shattering into 100 glittering pieces across the ground. The loud sound jolted her out of her frozen state. A deep, panicked flush crept rapidly up her neck. She abandoned her husband's side and rushed aggressively toward me, her arms raised as if she intended to physically block me from the view of her wealthy friends. She stopped just 2 feet away, her chest heaving with frantic, shallow breaths. She stared at the expensive fabric of my jacket, completely unable to reconcile the broken, shivering man she had kicked off her porch with the towering, impeccably dressed figure standing before her today. "Dad," she hissed, her voice a venomous, strained whisper designed to keep the guests from hearing her rising panic. "What the hell are you doing here? You are supposed to be at the clinic by now." And where in the world did you steal those expensive clothes? Get out of here right now before you completely ruin everything. Before I could even formulate a response to her breathtaking audacity, heavy footsteps pounded violently against the stone patio. Derek stormed over to join his wife, puffing out his chest in a pathetic display of territorial dominance. His face was twisted into a snarl of pure, unadulterated rage. He stepped directly into my personal space, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me in front of his wealthy peers. "I told you that you were not welcome on my property, old man." Derek growled, his voice intentionally loud enough for the closest guests to hear clearly. "You are clearly having a severe mental episode today. You are confused and acting entirely out of line. I am calling the local asylum right this second to come pick you up early. You belong in a locked ward, and I will make absolutely sure they put you in a straitjacket for trespassing on my property." He reached aggressively into his tailored slacks to retrieve his mobile phone, fully intending to execute the final cruel step of their medical proxy conspiracy right there in the garden. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I simply raised my right hand high into the air, signaling the perimeter of the yard. From the dark shadows of the tall privacy fence, Jonathan Bradley stepped smoothly onto the sunlit patio. I was immediately flanked by two highly seasoned financial detectives wearing dark, authoritative windbreakers. The crowd gasped in collective shock. Guests began to step backward, forming a wide, terrified circle around us, as the undeniable reality of a massive law enforcement raid completely shattered the arrogant illusion of their perfect suburban celebration. I looked Derek dead in the eye, my voice echoing with absolute unwavering power across the dead, silent yard. "I would not make that telephone call right now, Derek," I said slowly, savoring the absolute terror that finally began to register across his arrogant face. "Because the only people being taken away in handcuffs today are you, your father, and my deceitful daughter." The absolute silence that followed my words was incredibly profound. It was as if all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the sprawling suburban backyard. Derek stood completely frozen, his mouth hanging open, his arrogant posture completely dissolving into pure panic. Melissa backed away from me, her eyes darting frantically between the two stoic financial detectives standing behind my shoulders. Jonathan Bradley did not wait for them to recover from the initial shock. He stepped directly into the center of the patio, moving with the practiced, commanding authority of a seasoned corporate litigator who owned the entire room. He unclasped his thick leather briefcase and pulled out a heavy stack of official court-stamped documents. He did not lower his voice to protect their fragile reputations. He spoke with a booming theatrical projection that reached every single wealthy guest standing frozen on the manicured lawn. He announced to the crowd that he was formally serving legal seizure notices and criminal complaints against both Derek and Melissa Lawson. He lifted the first document high into the air. He detailed with surgical precision how the couple had systematically drained $45,000 in cash from the emergency retirement fund of a grieving widower. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Waiters stopped in their tracks. But Jonathan was just getting started. He pulled out the second, much thicker document. He raised his voice even louder, cutting through the rising murmurs of the stunned crowd. He announced that he held absolute forensic proof, backed by banking records and digital timestamps, that Melissa and Derek had maliciously forged my signature on official banking documents. He explained that they had illegally authorized a $200,000 home equity line of credit against my personal property, actively pushing my house into foreclosure to fund a massive criminal money laundering operation. The wealthy guests began to physically back away from Melissa and Derek, treating them as if they carried a highly contagious disease. The pristine illusion of their perfect upper-class life shattered completely right there on the expensive stone patio. While all eyes were fixed on the devastating legal spectacle Jonathan was putting on, I noticed a sudden desperate movement near the edge of the sparkling swimming pool. Martin Lawson had quietly stepped down from his small wooden podium. He had dropped his delicate crystal champagne flute into a nearby decorative bush. He was currently inching his way backward, keeping his head down as he tried to slip unnoticed toward the heavy wooden gate at the far end of the privacy fence. He moved with the cowardly, panicked urgency of a cornered rat desperately looking for a way out. I nodded silently toward the second financial detective standing by the perimeter. The detective moved with incredible speed, cutting across the perfectly cut grass and stepping squarely into Martin's escape path just as he reached for the metal latch of the back gate. Martin stumbled backward, his face completely drained of color, his chest heaving with terror. I walked slowly across the patio, my leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the stone tiles, until I stood directly in front of him. He looked absolutely pathetic, stripped of his boastful corporate persona. I reached into the interior pocket of my bespoke Italian suit jacket and pulled out a thick, heavily stamped corporate folder. I held it out and firmly pressed it right into the center of his chest. He took it with violently shaking hands. I looked him dead in his terrified eyes. "I bought your debt, Martin," I said, my voice low, sharp, and entirely devoid of any mercy. "Your entire shell company is completely bankrupt." I watched his eyes scan the top page of the corporate acquisition documents. The reality of his absolute financial ruin washed over his aging features. I stepped closer, closing the distance between us. "And your $13,000 luxury cruise ticket has been permanently voided by the International Fraud Department." I continued, ensuring every single word landed like a physical blow. "You aren't going to the Mediterranean. You're going to Federal Holding." The detective immediately stepped forward, grabbing Martin by his tailored shoulders. He spun the older man around forcefully, pressing his hands behind his back. The sharp, unmistakable metallic click of heavy police handcuffs echoed sharply across the quiet yard. Martin let out a pathetic, whimpering sob as the cold steel locked tightly around his wrists. On the main patio, the first detective had already moved in on Derek. Derek tried to resist, puffing out his chest and demanding to speak to his personal attorney. But the seasoned detective quickly swept his legs out from under him, forcing him down onto his knees right beside the bubbling champagne fountain. The second pair of steel handcuffs ratcheted tightly into place. Derek was completely neutralized, his face pressed in deep humiliation against the wet stone tiles of his own backyard. The entire operation was executed with flawless, devastating efficiency. The two men who had so casually plotted my absolute destruction were now completely stripped of their freedom, their stolen wealth, and their public dignity. They were criminals exposed in broad daylight, in front of the very society they had tried so desperately to impress. The sheer magnitude of their downfall was a testament to the fatal consequences of blinding greed. As the detectives hauled the men up, a shrill, agonizing scream pierced the afternoon air. Melissa completely lost whatever fragile composure she had left. She fell hard onto her knees, the rough stone patio scraping against her bare legs, ruining her expensive designer dress. She scrambled frantically across the ground toward me, ignoring the shocked stares of her wealthy friends. She reached out with trembling, desperate hands and tightly clutched the fabric of my pant leg. Tears streamed rapidly down her face, ruining her makeup. "Dad, please!" she sobbed, her voice cracking with wild, unrestrained panic. "Please do not do this. We are family. I was just incredibly stressed about money. It was not my idea to forge your signature. Derek made me do it. He manipulated me. He forced me to sign those papers to save his father. You have to believe me." She threw her husband under the heavy wheels of justice without a second of hesitation, proving exactly how hollow her loyalty truly was. She was crying solely for herself, desperately playing the victim one final pathetic time. I stood perfectly still, feeling the desperate grip of her manicured fingers pulling at my clothes. I looked down at her, staring at the woman kneeling in the spilled champagne and shattered glass. The little girl I had raised, the child I had protected with my own sweat and blood for 38 years, was completely gone. The person sobbing at my feet was nothing but a manipulative, greedy stranger. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no lingering parental guilt. I reached down and firmly pried her clutching fingers away from my suit. I took a deliberate step backward, separating myself from her toxic presence forever. I had already taken away her house, her stolen wealth, and her freedom. But I had one final devastating blow left. Melissa was still desperately clutching at the empty air, where my pant leg had been just seconds before. Her makeup ran in dark, ugly streaks down her pale cheeks. She was waiting for salvation, hoping that some lingering fragment of a father's love would suddenly overpower the reality of her own monstrous actions. I reached slowly into the interior breast pocket of my custom Italian suit. I did not pull out a handkerchief to dry her tears. I pulled out a crisp, high-resolution, color-printed photograph. I held it gently between my thumb and index finger for just a moment, allowing the bright afternoon sun to illuminate the glossy paper. Then I let it slip from my grasp. The photograph fluttered downward in total silence, landing softly on the wet grass, directly in front of Melissa's face. She stopped sobbing for a fraction of a second. Her tear-filled eyes dropped to look at the paper resting near her knees. It was a perfectly scaled image of the crumpled $2 gas station scratch-off ticket she had so carelessly thrown onto my plate on Father's Day. But it was not just a picture of the ticket. Stamped across the very center of the image in thick, undeniable red ink was the official verification seal from the State Lottery Commission and my private bank. Below the matching winning numbers was the verified payout amount, $120 million. Melissa stared at the photograph, her brain completely unable to process the astronomical string of zeros printed across the bottom of the glossy page. Her mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping for air on a dry dock. She looked up at me, her expression twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. The sheer magnitude of the numerical figure completely paralyzed her vocal cords. I stepped slightly closer to her, ensuring my voice was low, steady, and loud enough for her husband and his father to hear from where they were securely restrained by the financial detectives. "You sat at your massive dining table and told me I could not travel," I said, every word dripping with absolute freezing clarity. "You handed me a $2 joke while you simultaneously spent the exact money I had saved for my own funeral on a cowardly corporate crook. You tried to legally erase my existence and lock me inside a locked dementia ward just to steal the equity of my home. But you made one fatal, irreversible miscalculation. That cheap $2 joke you tossed at me actually hit the jackpot, Melissa. $120 million. And the most tragic part of this entire miserable situation is that as my only living child, you would have naturally inherited every single cent of that massive fortune. If you had just shown me a single ounce of basic human decency, you would have lived like an absolute queen for the rest of your natural life." The horrific weight of my words finally slammed into her like a physical freight train. I watched the last remaining traces of color drain completely from her face, leaving her skin an absolute sickly white. She picked up the photograph with violently trembling hands. She looked at the verified numbers, and then she looked at Derek. Derek was straining against the heavy steel handcuffs, his eyes bulging wildly as he read the staggering financial figure over her shoulder. The brutal realization of what they had just sacrificed completely shattered their fragile minds. Melissa let out a sound I had never heard a human being make before. It was a guttural, agonizing, deeply primal wail of pure, unadulterated regret. It echoed terribly across the silent garden, sending a shiver down the spines of her wealthy guests. She had not just lost her expensive house, her stolen funds, and her physical freedom. She had actively, deliberately thrown away a literal $100 million empire for a few stolen pennies. She clawed at the wet grass, screaming my name over and over again, begging for a second chance that she absolutely did not deserve. Her devastating screams filled the affluent backyard, but they did not touch my heart in the slightest. I felt absolutely nothing for the miserable strangers writhing on the wet stone patio. I turned my back to them smoothly, adjusting my tailored cuffs as the local detectives formally began reading them their Miranda rights. The crowd of wealthy guests parted like the Red Sea, staring in stunned silence as I walked slowly and deliberately back toward the heavy wrought iron gates. I stepped out of the yard, climbed back into the waiting black SUV with Jonathan Bradley, and we drove away from the absolute wreckage of their lives. I did not look out the tinted window as we pulled away. I kept my eyes focused entirely on the road ahead, feeling the incredible lifting sensation of a massive burden finally being removed from my tired shoulders. 6 months later, the justice system had completely run its course with relentless efficiency. Melissa, Derek, and Martin are currently serving lengthy sentences in a maximum security federal prison for their elaborate financial crimes, felony forgery, and their terrifying elder abuse conspiracy. I am no longer standing in the freezing rain on a stone porch, begging for basic shelter. Today, I am standing on the sunlit teak deck of a massive, private luxury yacht that I purchased entirely in cash. I am currently cruising through the crystal-clear waters of the Mediterranean Sea, taking the exact vacation they had tried to steal using my funeral money. I used a large portion of the blind trust to establish a powerful, well-funded charity for elder abuse victims in Patricia's name, ensuring that no vulnerable senior will ever have to face the terrifying isolation that I faced. As the warm ocean breeze washes over my face, the heavy shadows of the past completely dissolve into the bright horizon. For the first time in many years, the sea air smells like absolute, unbroken peace. True wealth is never measured by the digits resting inside your bank account, but by the integrity you carry within your heart. Greed is a blinding, toxic poison that makes people trade priceless, lifelong relationships for cheap, fleeting gains. My daughter and her husband firmly believed they were outsmarting a vulnerable old man, but their malicious deception became the very architect of their own absolute destruction. Honesty requires no maintenance, while a foundation built on deceit will inevitably collapse under its own crushing weight. Always treat the people who love you with basic respect and decency, because you never know when the person you are stepping on holds the absolute key to your entire future. Have you ever experienced a deep betrayal that completely changed your perspective on someone you truly trusted? How did you find the strength to walk away and rebuild your life? Please share your stories in the comments below. I always read every single one of them. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and share this video today.